Maggie Collins slammed the ledger shut so hard, the oil lamp rattled on the desk, and her hands would not stop shaking. Not because she was afraid, because she had just found the third set of books, the real ones, hidden behind a false panel in the bottom drawer of Richard Hale's filing cabinet, and every single number inside them told the same story. This ranch had been stolen slowly, methodically over 7 years, and nobody had done a thing to stop it. She pressed both palms flat against the desk and stared at the wall and thought, I see it. I see all of it. And then the door behind her opened. If this story is already pulling you in, please take 1 second to subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Every new story goes straight to you the moment it drops. Drop a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from. I read every single one, and I want to know how far this story has traveled. Now stay with me. Because what happens next in Silver Creek will change everything you think you know about who holds the power and who was never supposed to find out. The bus dropped Maggie Collins at the edge of the Silver Creek Road on a Tuesday morning in October, and it did not wait for her to get her footing before it pulled away and left her standing in the dust. She had one suitcase, a canvas bag over her shoulder, and a folded piece of paper in her coat pocket with the name of the ranch and the name of the man who had agreed reluctantly, and after 3 separate letters of inquiry, to give her a 2-week trial as a bookkeeper. She was 49 years old. She was a widow of 8 months. She was a large woman, broad-shouldered, full-figured, solid in the way that years of hard living make a person solid, and she had learned long before she ever set foot in Montana that most rooms decided what they thought of her before she opened her mouth. She picked up her suitcase and started walking. The ranch came into view after 20 minutes on the gravel road. It was larger than she had imagined from the correspondence. 3 barns, a long, low bunkhouse, fenced pastures running east toward the tree line, and a main house with a wraparound porch that looked like it had once been cared for and wasn't anymore. She stopped at the gate, read the sign, Silver Creek Ranch, established 1889. You lost. The voice came from her left. A man was crouched near the bottom rail of the fence working a wire splice with both hands, not looking up. No, Maggie said. I'm the new bookkeeper. The man glanced up then. He was lean, weathered, somewhere in his 40s, with a hat pulled low and eyes that were quiet in the way that some people's eyes are when they have spent a long time watching and very little time talking. Hale know you're here? He asked. He's expecting me. The man looked at her for another moment. Not the way most men looked at her. Not with that quick assessment, followed by the slight withdrawal, the almost imperceptible decision that she was not worth the full consideration, but steadily without judgment, the way a person looks at something they are genuinely trying to understand. Main house, he said, and went back to his wire. She went to the main house. Richard Hale met her on the porch steps, and Maggie knew within the first 30 seconds of standing in front of him exactly who he was. She had known men like Richard Hale her entire adult life. They came in every shape and size, but they were always recognizable, the way they stood, with their weight slightly forward, the way their eyes moved over a person, and calculated value in a single sweep, the way their voice carried just enough warmth to seem welcoming, while every word was actually a measurement. Mrs. Collins, he said, extending a hand. You made good time. The bus was on schedule, she said, shaking it. His grip was firm in the deliberate way, the kind of firm that is a message rather than a courtesy. He was tall, well-dressed for a ranch manager, silver-haired at the temples, the sort of man who had learned early that appearance was its own form of authority. I'll be direct with you, he said, leading her inside without asking if she needed a moment. The books are a mess. Previous bookkeeper left without notice. I need someone who can organize, not analyze. You understand the distinction? I understand it, Maggie said. Good. You'll have the office off the supply room. The files go back 7 years. I need a clean summary of operating expenses for the county land board by end of November. That's your primary task. What happened to the previous bookkeeper? Maggie asked. Hale paused, just briefly, just long enough. Personal circumstances, he said. Family situation, nothing related to the work. He showed her the office. It was a small room functional with a heavy oak desk, 2 filing cabinets, a window that faced the south pasture, and 7 years of ledgers stacked on shelves without any consistent ordering system. Maggie stood in the doorway and looked at the shelves for a long time. "I'll need a lamp that actually works," she said finally. "That one flickers." "I'll have it replaced," Hale said, and left her there. She set down her suitcase. She sat at the desk. She pulled the closest ledger from the shelf, 2019 Operating Expenses General, and opened it to the first page. And she started reading. She did not eat dinner that first evening. She sat in that office with the replaced lamp burning steady, and she read until her eyes ached. And outside the window, the ranch went dark and quiet, and she could hear the distant sound of cattle shifting in the east pasture. By midnight, she had read through 14 months of records, and she had found the first thing that did not add up: a supplier invoice. Triple Fork Supply dated March 2019 for $460 of fencing material. Cross-referenced against the delivery log, nothing. No confirmation of receipt. No corresponding entry in the physical inventory record for that quarter. Maggie marked the page with a strip of paper and kept reading. By 2 in the morning, she had found 3 more. She sat back in her chair and looked at the lamp and thought carefully. 4 missing invoices in 14 months could be sloppy accounting. Could be a distracted bookkeeper. Could be any number of ordinary innocent explanations. She told herself that. She closed the ledger. She went to the small room she'd been assigned in the second building, and she lay down on the narrow bed, and she stared at the ceiling, and she thought about the way Richard Hale had paused just that fraction of a second when she asked about the previous bookkeeper. She did not sleep well. In the morning, she was back at the desk before 6. The ranch came alive around her boots on gravel, voices across the yard, the mechanical sounds of a working property starting its day. She heard Hale's voice at one point carrying across the yard with that particular authority that does not invite response, issuing instructions to someone about the northern pasture rotation. She kept reading. At 8:30, someone knocked on the open office door. She looked up. It was the man from the fence. He was holding 2 cups of coffee, and he looked mildly uncertain about whether he'd made a social error. "Thought you might have missed the breakfast bell," he said. "I did," Maggie said. "On purpose. Thank you." He set one of the cups on the corner of her desk. He looked at the ledgers spread open in front of her. She had 3 going simultaneously, by that point, cross-referencing between years. "You work fast," he said. "I work careful," she said. "Those aren't the same thing." He almost smiled. Not quite. "No, ma'am, they're not." "What's your name?" she asked. "Holloway," he said. "Jack Holloway." "Maggie Collins." He nodded. He picked up the empty cup he'd set down. He looked at the ledgers one more time with those quiet eyes. "You find anything interesting yet?" he asked. She looked at him steadily. "Should I?" Something shifted in his face. Not alarm, not guilt, but something more considered, more patient. "Silver Creek's been running for a long time," he said. "Old records get complicated." "Most records do," Maggie said, "when someone wants them to be." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "You need anything else, you can find me at the north fence line most mornings." And he left. Maggie watched the empty doorway for a moment. Then she turned back to the ledgers. The days established themselves into a pattern. She arrived before 6. She worked through breakfast and most of lunch. She ate dinner in the ranch kitchen with the other workers, a group of 8 men who treated her with the careful, slightly baffled courtesy that men extend to a woman they don't know how to categorize, which suited her fine. Richard Hale sat at the head of the table and held court with the easy authority of a man who has never once doubted his position. He checked in on her office twice a day. Always pleasant. Always just slightly too interested in exactly what she was looking at. "Making progress?" he asked on the 3rd afternoon, leaning against the doorframe. "Slow going," Maggie said, not looking up. "The filing system needs work." Previous bookkeeper had her own method. "I can see that," Maggie said neutrally. "As long as you've got the operating summary on track for November," he said. "On track," she confirmed. He left. She waited until she heard his boot, her own notebook, not the ranch's, and she wrote down the fourth discrepancy she'd found that morning and the connecting thread she'd noticed between it and two of the first ones. The supplier names were different. The invoice dates were spread across multiple quarters, but the bank account numbers for the payments buried in the remittance records were identical on 6 separate transactions totaling just under $12,000. 6 payments. Same account. Different supplier names. Maggie underlined the account number 3 times. That evening, walking back from dinner, she passed the north fence line. Jack Holloway was still out there in the near dark, working on a post that had shifted in the soft ground near the creek. She stopped. "Do you always work this late?" she asked. "Ground's easier when it's cool," he said. She stood there for a moment. The creek made its small sounds in the dark. Somewhere in the distance, a horse moved through the pasture. "How long have you worked here?" she asked. "Long enough," he said. "Long enough to know the ranch well." He set down his tools and looked at her. In the low evening light, his face was harder to read, but she had the same sense she'd had that first morning at the fence that he was doing far more thinking than he was showing. "I know every acre of this property," he said quietly. "Every fence line, every boundary marker, every inch of what belongs to Silver Creek and what doesn't." "And the books?" she asked. "Do you know those too?" The silence between them stretched. "Mrs. Collins," he said finally, "some questions are better asked after you already know the answer." She considered that. "That's a strange thing for a fence hand to say." "It's a strange ranch," he said simply, and picked up his tools again. She walked back to her office. She worked until midnight. By the end of the first week, she had cross-referenced 4 years of ledgers against the delivery logs, the payroll records, the land transaction files, and the county tax submissions. The picture was not clear yet. It was more like a shape emerging from fog edges, uncertain center hidden, but the shape was there, and it was wrong. The fake invoices were only the surface. Beneath them, payroll entries for workers who did not appear in any other record on the ranch. No housing assignment, no tool checkout, no injury log, no name in the kitchen dinner count. Ghost workers drawing wages that went somewhere she couldn't yet trace. And beneath that, land transaction records, 3 of them dated 2017 and 2018, for parcels that she could not cross-reference against the county assessor records she'd brought with her from the public filing office in town. Parcels that, as far as she could determine, did not exist. She sat with that for a long time. Then she pulled out her notebook and she wrote at the top of a clean page, "This is not disorganization. This is architecture. Someone had built this system. Someone with patience and sophistication and access to every level of the ranch's financial records. And they had built it over years carefully in layers so that any single piece looked like an error, but the whole was a machine." On the 9th day, Richard Hale came to her office in the afternoon and closed the door behind him. Maggie looked up from the ledger she was reading. "How are you settling in?" he asked. His voice was the same as always, warm, controlled, carrying that undercurrent of assessment. "Fine," she said. "Thank you. I wanted to check in about the scope of the work." He sat in the chair across from her desk without being invited. "The summary I need for November is straightforward operating expenses, capital expenditures, net revenue, standard reporting. I don't want you spending time on anything outside that scope." Maggie looked at him steadily. "What would be outside that scope?" "Historical discrepancies," he said. "Old records have errors. Every ranch does. Chasing those errors doesn't help anyone. It creates confusion, raises questions that don't have clean answers, wastes time we don't have." "I understand," Maggie said. Something moved behind his eyes. A calculation. "Good," he said and stood. "You're doing excellent work, Mrs. Collins. I'd hate to see you get distracted from what actually matters." He left. She did not move for a full minute after the door closed. Then she got up, went to the filing cabinet in the corner, the second one, the one Hale had unlocked for her on day 1, and told her contained the historical supplier files, and she looked at the bottom drawer. She had opened it on the first day. Standard files, nothing unusual. She opened it again now, pushed the hanging folders all the way to the back of the drawer, pressed her fingers against the rear panel. It was not flush with the frame. She pressed harder. It gave slightly a quarter inch, maybe less, and she felt the edge of something behind it. She stood up. She went to the door. She looked across the yard. Hale was at the far barn, talking to two of the ranch hands, his back to her building. She went back to the cabinet. She worked her fingers into the gap at the edge of the false panel. It took 3 minutes, and she broke 2 fingernails, but it came free. Behind it, a second set of files, slimmer, bound with rubber bands, and at the back of those files a ledger, narrower than the others. Dark green cover, no label. She pulled it out. She set it on the desk. She opened it to the first page. The entries started in 2016. She read for 45 minutes without moving, without looking up, without breathing correctly. When she finally closed the ledger and pressed both palms flat on the desk and looked at the wall, what she felt was not fear, or not only fear. What she felt was the vertiginous, clarifying sensation of a woman who has suspected something terrible and has just learned she did not suspect nearly enough. This was not a manager skimming from the operating budget. This was the systematic dismantling of a ranch's financial identity, executed over years, with the precision of someone who understood not just accounting, but legal structure, land law, and institutional process. Fake parcels sold to shell companies. Payroll built for laborers who never existed. Supplier relationships constructed entirely on paper, and underneath all of it, invisible in the standard records, a transfer pattern that redirected funds through 6 different accounts before the money disappeared entirely. Maggie sat there in the lamplight with the green ledger in front of her, and she thought about the previous bookkeeper, the one who had left without notice. Personal circumstances, Hale had said. Family situation. She thought about the look on Jack Holloway's face when he asked if she'd found anything interesting. Some questions are better asked after you already know the answer. She closed the green ledger. She put it back behind the false panel. She replaced the panel carefully and pushed the hanging folders back into position. Then she sat at her desk, and she opened the operating expense file for 2023, and she stared at it without reading it, because her mind was already somewhere else, entirely turning over what she knew and what she still needed and what she was going to do with it. The lamp burned steady. Outside Silver Creek went on about its evening, and Maggie Collins made herself a promise, quiet and absolute in the particular way of a woman who has already survived things that were supposed to break her. She was going to read every page, every number, every line. She was going to build the case until there was not a single gap in it, and then she was going to decide what to do with the truth. She did not tell anyone what she had found. That was the first decision, and she made it the same night she replaced the false panel and sat back down at her desk with the ordinary operating files open in front of her, like nothing had happened. She had learned across 49 years of living in a world that consistently underestimated her, that information was only power if you controlled who had it and when. The moment you showed your hand too early, you lost everything. The moment you let someone know, you were afraid they used it. So she showed nothing. She went to dinner. She ate. She answered the questions that were asked of her. Yes, the filing system was coming along. Yes, she thought she'd have a preliminary summary ready for Hale's review by the 3rd week of the month, and she watched Richard Hale at the head of the table, and she kept her face entirely still. He watched her back. She had expected that. What she had not quite expected was how good he was at it. How seamlessly his attention moved across the table, touching each person briefly, before moving on, so that if you weren't paying careful attention, you would not notice that he returned to her more than anyone else. 3 times over the course of dinner. Each time for just a moment. Each time with that same warm, calibrated expression that gave away absolutely nothing. She was dealing with a professional. She had understood that intellectually from the green ledger. She understood it differently now, sitting across a dinner table from him, watching him perform normalcy with the ease of long practice. She needed to be more careful than she had ever been in her life, The second decision she made that night was to change her method. She had been reading chronologically, working forward from the oldest records. That was the right approach for building a complete picture, but it was also the approach that left her most exposed. The longer she spent in the historical files, the more obvious it became that she was looking for something beyond the November summary. So she pulled the current year's operating files to the front of her desk, and she began working on the legitimate summary in parallel, making real visible progress on the task Hale had actually hired her to do, so that every time he looked through the doorway, there was something clean and current and explainable sitting on top. Beneath the desk in her canvas bag, she kept her notebook. Every number that mattered went into that notebook. Every account reference, every ghost payroll entry, every land parcel description from the green ledger. She was rebuilding the architecture from memory, and from the brief access she allowed herself each night, 20-30 minutes in the false panel files before she restored everything exactly as she'd found it, and transferring the critical pieces to pages that would leave with her every evening. It was on the 12th day that Jack Holloway knocked on her office door a second time. She had been cross-referencing a set of supplier payment records, and she did not look up immediately. "Come in." He came in. He stood with his hat in his hands. She noticed he always removed it indoors, a small courtesy that felt genuine rather than performed, and he looked at the organized stacks on her desk with an expression she was learning to read, attentive, restrained, giving almost nothing away. "Need to ask you something," he said. "Go ahead." "The North Pasture fence inventory," he said. "Hale's asking me to submit a materials request for next quarter. He said to confirm the supply account numbers with you, said the bookkeeper tracks those." Maggie looked at him then. He was looking back at her with those quiet eyes, and she held that look for a moment and understood something. This was not about fence inventory. She did not know exactly what it was, but it was not about fence inventory. "Sit down, Mr. Holloway," she said. He sat. He set his hat on his knee and waited. "Which supply account?" she asked. "Triple Fork," he said. "And the secondary one, Western Range Materials." Both names were in her notebook. Both had appeared in the false panel ledger. Triple Fork had 6 fraudulent invoices across 3 years. Western Range Materials had 4 + 2 land transaction cross-references that she hadn't fully traced yet. She kept her face neutral. "I'll have to pull those files. Give me until tomorrow morning." "Appreciate it," he said. And then, without any change in tone, "You sleeping all right?" She looked at him. "Why?" Light in this office was on past 2 in the morning, 3 nights running. She held very still. "You noticed that from the bunkhouse." "I notice a lot of things," he said quietly. "From a lot of places." The silence between them had weight in it. She could feel him measuring something, and she was measuring him right back, and she was aware that this was a moment with edges, that what she said next would determine something important, and she did not yet have enough information to know what. "I'm a thorough worker," she said finally. "Always have been." "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I can see that." He picked up his hat. He stood. He looked at the files on her desk one more time. That look that was not casual, that had never been casual, and then he said, "Mrs. Collins, whatever you're finding in those records." He paused. He seemed to be deciding something. "Be careful how you carry it," he said. "Some weight'll break you if you try to hold it alone." He left. Maggie sat very still for a long time after the sound of his boots faded across the yard. Then she opened her notebook to a clean page and wrote at the top, "Jack Holloway." What does he know? What does he want me to know? She stared at that for a moment. Then she wrote underneath it. He knew the supplier names. He used them deliberately. He's been watching my office. She closed the notebook and put it in her bag. She pulled Triple Fork's file from the cabinet. She was going to find out exactly who Jack Holloway was, but first, she was going to finish building the case because nothing else mattered until she had every number locked down and documented and beyond any reasonable challenge. The Triple Fork file was ordinary on its surface. A legitimate supplier relationship going back to 2015. Real invoices, real deliveries, real payment confirmations for the first 2 years. Then in 2017, the pattern shifted. The invoices continued. The delivery confirmations continued. But the payment remittances, the actual bank transfer records, began routing through a different account than the one listed on the supplier contract. The difference was subtle enough that a distracted bookkeeper or one not looking for it would miss it entirely. The account numbers were similar. Not identical, but similar enough that in a dense page of financial records, your eye would slide past the discrepancy unless you were specifically hunting for it. Maggie was specifically hunting for it. She found the account diversion in Triple Fork's file on a Wednesday. She found the same pattern in Western Range Materials on Thursday. By Friday, she had identified a third supplier. High Plains Equipment, with an identical structure, legitimate relationship, gradual transition, diverted payments. 3 suppliers, 17 diverted transactions across 6 years. Total somewhere between $40,000 and $50,000 depending on how the shell account transfers resolved. And that was only what she could trace from the supplier files. The green ledger had more. She hadn't fully mapped the payroll manipulation yet. She hadn't traced the land parcel transactions to their endpoints. The machine was larger than she had initially understood, and it was still getting larger. On Friday afternoon, Richard Hale stopped in her doorway and leaned against the frame with his arms crossed and that familiar warmth arranged on his face. "End of week 2, he said. "How's the summary coming?" She turned the monitor toward him. She'd been building the legitimate summary in a spreadsheet. Real numbers, real categories, clean and organized. "On track," she said. "I'll have a draft for you by Wednesday." He looked at the screen. He nodded slowly. "Good. You're faster than I expected." "I appreciate that," she said, finding the files manageable, nothing too confusing in the older records. She met his eyes. "Nothing I can't work through," she said. He held her gaze for just a moment longer than was entirely natural. "Good," he said again. "That's what I like to hear." And he pushed off the doorframe and walked away. Maggie turned back to her desk. Her hands were steady. She was proud of that. That evening, she did not go straight back to her room after dinner. She walked the ranch perimeter instead, the long way the route that took her past the north fence line. It was deliberate. She needed to think, and thinking required motion, and motion required being somewhere that was not that office with those files pressing against her from every direction. She heard him before she saw him. The sound of a wire tool working that particular metallic rhythm she'd already come to associate with Jack Holloway, the way you come to associate a specific sound with a specific person when you've been paying careful attention. She stopped. "Mr. Holloway." "Mrs. Collins." He didn't stop working. "I pulled the Triple Fork file," she said, "and Western Range Materials. Find what you needed." "I found considerably more than I was looking for." He was quiet for a moment, still working. "That happens sometimes," he said, "with old records." "These weren't old errors," she said. Her voice was flat and even, and she let it be. "This was constructed, deliberately, carefully over years. Whoever built this system understood financial structure well enough to hide it from anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it." The wire tool stopped moving. "And you were specifically looking," he said. "I was specifically looking." He turned to face her. It was darker now, the last of the evening light flattening everything, and she could not read his expression as well as she would have liked. But she could read his posture, the way he had gone very still, the particular stillness of a man who is managing something larger than what he is showing. "Mrs. Collins," he said, and his voice was different. Not cold, but stripped of the casual ranch hand ease she'd been hearing for 2 weeks. Quieter. More direct. "How much have you found?" "Enough to know I haven't found all of it," she said. "Supplier diversions, ghost payroll, land transactions that reference parcels I cannot locate in any county record." He was silent for a long moment. "How are you carrying that?" he asked. "The knowing." "Carefully," she said. "The same way I carry everything." Something moved across his face. She thought it might have been respect, but she had learned not to name things too quickly. "The previous bookkeeper," he said. Her name was Carol Briggs. She was here 6 weeks before she left. Maggie waited. She found something, he said. Not as much as you've found, enough to make Hale nervous. She came to me, asked me if she was reading the records right. He paused. 2 days later, she was gone. Hale told everyone her mother had taken ill back in Nebraska. Was that true? Maggie asked. Her mother's been dead 11 years, Jack said quietly. The weight of that settled between them. She left alive? Maggie asked. Her voice was even. She needed to know, and she needed to ask it directly. Yes, he said immediately. He scared her out. He's good at that, making people understand that the cost of staying is higher than the cost of going. He doesn't need to do more than that usually. Most people aren't built to hold their ground when someone like Hale decides to push. Most people, Maggie said. Most people, he agreed. And something in the way he said it, the slight weight on the word most, the way his eyes held on her face told her that he was making a statement about her specifically, and that he had been making it since the first morning she'd walked through that gate. Mr. Holloway, she said, what is your actual role on this ranch? The silence that followed was the longest one yet. She counted seconds, got to 7 before he answered. That's a question I'll answer, he said carefully. But not tonight. Tonight I need to know something from you first. He looked at her with those steady, unreadable eyes. Are you going to run? She thought about her suitcase in her room, her canvas bag with the notebook inside it, the bus that had dropped her on this road 14 days ago with nowhere else to be and no other options on the table, the husband who had left her debts and a hollowed-out house, and the particular cruelty of a life that had spent 30 years telling her she was not quite enough of whatever she was supposed to be. No, she said. I'm not going to run. He nodded once, slowly, like he'd expected it, but had needed to hear it. Then keep reading, he said. Everything. Every page, every number, every line. Don't stop, and don't skip anything. He picked up his wire tool. And don't tell me what you find until you've found all of it. Whatever you think you already know, you don't have the whole picture yet. She looked at him for a moment longer. That sounds like someone who already knows what the whole picture looks like, she said. He didn't deny it. He just said, "Good night, Mrs. Collins." She walked back toward the main building in the dark, and she was thinking about Carol Briggs, who had found something and been pushed out, about the green ledger behind the false panel, about the land parcels that didn't exist in any county record, about the way Jack Holloway's voice had changed when she described what she had found, that stripping away of the ranch hand eased down to something underneath that was harder and more deliberate. And more, she kept coming back to this word, more proprietary than any fence worker had any business being about a ranch's financial records. She went to her office. She locked the door, something she had not done before. She opened the bottom drawer of the second filing cabinet. She worked the false panel free. She pulled out the green ledger and opened it to the land transaction section. And she began reading with the particular focus of a woman who has just been told she doesn't have the whole picture yet, which is the most motivating thing anyone has ever said to Maggie Collins in her entire life. The land transactions were documented across 11 pages. She had read them before, but she had read them looking for fraud. Now she read them looking for ownership. The parcels sold were described with survey coordinates. She traced them on the county map she'd pulled from the public office in town during her first week. 3 parcels surveyed 2016 and 2017 boundaries described in precise legal language. She had not been able to match them to county records before. Now, reading with different eyes, she realized why. The coordinates did not describe parcels outside Silver Creek's boundary. They described sections within it. Sections of Silver Creek Ranch itself, sold through forged documentation to shell companies, the transfers recorded in the false ledger in a way that obscured what was actually being sold. Someone had been attempting for years to quietly transfer ownership of Silver Creek Ranch's most valuable sections out of the ranch's name and into shell entities that would eventually consolidate under single control. She sat with that for a full minute. Let the full shape of it settle. This was not embezzlement. This was not even sophisticated fraud. This was a theft of the ranch itself, and it was not finished. The transactions in the green ledger represented 60% of Silver Creek's total acreage. The remaining 40%, including the main house, the water rights, the primary cattle ranges, had not yet been transferred. Which meant it was still in progress. Which meant she had arrived in the middle of it. She closed the ledger. She put it back. She replaced the panel with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be. She picked up her notebook. She turned to the page where she had written Jack Holloway. What does he know? What does he want me to know? She crossed out the second question. She already knew the answer to it. He wanted her to know everything. He had been guiding her toward the complete picture from the very first morning the supplier names he had dropped into that conversation about fence inventory. The late light observations that told her he was watching without alarming her. And tonight the most deliberate move of all, telling her she didn't have the whole picture yet, so that she would go back and find it. She wrote a new question underneath. Why can't he do this himself? She stared at that for a long time. Then she wrote slowly the answer that was forming itself from everything she had observed in 2 weeks on this ranch. Because whatever Jack Holloway actually is, he can't be the one to bring the evidence forward. It has to be someone else. It has to be the bookkeeper. She put the notebook in her bag. She turned off the lamp. She lay on her narrow bed and stared at the dark ceiling of her room and thought about a quiet man with proprietary eyes watching a ranch from the ground level. And she thought about a fraud that had been running for years with no one stopping it. And she thought, he's been waiting. He's been waiting for someone who wouldn't run. And she felt beneath the fear and the weight of what she was carrying. Something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt necessary. She spent the weekend rebuilding everything from the beginning, not because she had missed anything she hadn't, but because she needed the complete architecture laid out in a form that another person could follow. Her notebook was dense with her own shorthand cross-references that made sense to her and would make sense to no one else. If something happened to her and she was not dramatic about this, she simply acknowledged it as a realistic possibility, given what she now knew about Carol Briggs. The work needed to survive without her being there to explain it. She bought a second notebook from the general store in town on Saturday morning. Walked in, bought it, walked out, exchanged 4 words with the woman at the counter. On the way back, she passed 2 of the ranch hands in the truck and nodded to them. And they nodded back and nobody said anything unusual. Normal Saturday, normal widow bookkeeper buying normal supplies. She spent Saturday night and most of Sunday transferring everything into the second notebook in clean sequential cross-referenced order. Every fraudulent invoice with its date amount and diverted account number. Every ghost payroll entry with the corresponding pay period and the routing information. Every land transaction with its survey coordinates and the shell company names that appeared in the transfer documentation. By Sunday midnight, she had 31 pages of documented fraud covering 7 years of systematic theft. She read it through once from the beginning. Then she put that notebook inside the lining of her suitcase in the gap between the interior fabric and the hard shell that she had discovered years ago when the lining had started to separate. She pressed it flat. She set the suitcase back in the corner of her room with her folded clothes on top of it. Then she went to sleep. And she slept better than she had since arriving at Silver Creek. Monday morning, Richard Hale was waiting outside her office when she arrived, not inside. Outside, leaning against the exterior wall with his coffee and that arranged pleasantness on his face, which told her he had been there long enough to want her to know he had been waiting, but not long enough to look impatient. It was a precise calculation. She was beginning to understand that everything about Richard Hale was a precise calculation. "Good morning," she said, unlocking the door. "Morning, Maggie." The use of her first name was new. She noted it without showing that she had. "I wanted to catch you before the day got going. Hop in for a second." She went in. He followed her. She sat at her desk. He took the chair across from her without being invited, which was also a familiar move by now. "I had a conversation with the county land board Friday afternoon," he said. "They've moved up the reporting deadline. Need the operating summary by the end of this month rather than end of November." Maggie kept her expression cooperative. "That's a tighter window." "It is," he agreed. "I want to make sure we're focused on exactly what they need and nothing more. Clean numbers, current year, standard format. He leaned forward slightly. Relevant to that summary. Of course, she said. What specifically should I deprioritize? The historical files, he said. Anything pre-2021. For the purposes of this submission, we only need current operating data. She nodded slowly. I'll refocus accordingly. He looked at her. She looked back. Two people in a small room, each one knowing something the other did not know. They knew both performing something that was not quite a conversation. I appreciate your flexibility, he said, and stood and left. Maggie sat for a moment. Then she opened the current year's operating file and began working on the legitimate summary with focused, visible concentration, because she was absolutely certain that Richard Hale would find a reason to walk past her door at least twice in the next 2 hours. He walked past 3 times. She did not look up from the spreadsheet. It was at 11:15 during his third pass that she heard him stop. She kept her eyes on the screen. That second filing cabinet, he said from the doorway. The historical supplier files. I'm going to have those moved to the archive room in the main barn. Free up some space in here for you. She looked up then, kept her voice entirely easy. That's fine. Do you want me to refile anything before they go? No need, he said. I'll have one of the men move the whole cabinet this afternoon. Whenever works, she said, and looked back at the screen. She heard him walk away. She did not move for a full count of 10. Then she opened her canvas bag, confirmed her notebook was inside, confirmed her pen was clipped to the cover, and went back to the spreadsheet. He was going to move the cabinet, which meant he was going to discover the false panel, which meant he either already suspected she had found it, or he was removing the evidence regardless as a precaution, because something in the last week had made him nervous enough to start cleaning house. Either way, she had already copied everything that mattered. The green ledger was going to disappear from that cabinet, and she was going to let it go without any visible reaction, because the only thing that mattered now was that she had 31 pages of documented fraud in the lining of her suitcase, and Richard Hale did not know it. The cabinet was gone by 2 o'clock. She watched 2 of the ranch hands carry it across the yard from her window, not moving from her desk, expression unchanged. That evening, she found Jack Holloway at the north fence line, same as always, and she did not waste time on approach. He moved the cabinet, she said. Jack straightened slowly. When? This afternoon, and he's moved the reporting deadline up, wants only current year data, wants me off the historical files. Jack was quiet for a moment. Then, he's accelerating. That's what it looks like to me, she said. Which means he's close to something. One of the land transactions, or all of them, is near completion. He needs the audit trail cleaned before someone official looks at the books. Jack turned away from the fence and faced her fully. She had learned by now to pay attention when he did, that it was not a casual movement. How complete is your documentation? He asked. Complete, she said. All of it. Dated, cross-referenced account numbers, survey coordinates, shell company names. 31 pages. Something crossed his face. It was not quite relief. It was more like the particular expression of a man who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time and has just felt someone else put their hands on it too. Where is it? He asked. Safe, she said. Not in the office. Not anywhere he can find it without taking apart my personal belongings. Jack nodded. Good. That's good. He paused. There's something I need to tell you now. I know, she said. He looked at her. You know, I know you're not a ranch hand, she said. I've known for a while. The way you talk about the property, the survey coordinates in the land transaction files, you knew exactly which parcels they were when you looked at that map in my office, and you looked at it for about half a second before you stopped yourself. The supplier names you fed me on day 12. The way Hale looks at you, not like a manager looks at a worker, but like a man looks at a problem he hasn't fully solved yet. Jack was very still. What I don't know, Maggie said, is exactly what your relationship to this ranch is. And I think you need to tell me now because whatever I do with this evidence, I need to understand the full situation first. The silence held for several seconds. She waited him out. She had learned that with Jack Holloway waiting was always worth it. "Silver Creek Ranch belonged to my father," he said. "Thomas Holloway. He built it from nothing, same as the sign says 1889. He died in 2015 and left it to me." He stopped. Let that sit. Richard Hale was his ranch manager for 12 years. When my father died, Hale filed paperwork claiming a partial ownership stake based on a verbal agreement my father allegedly made in his final months. "Was the agreement real?" Maggie asked. "My father had a stroke in 2014, Jack said flatly. He couldn't form a verbal agreement about what to have for breakfast, let alone a legal transfer of ranch ownership. Hale produced a document, signed, notarized, witnessed, my father's signature on it." "Forged," Maggie said. "Forged," Jack confirmed. "I couldn't prove it. The notary was legitimate, scared, bought off, I don't know. The witnesses were men who had worked for Hale for years and wouldn't contradict him. My attorneys told me the document would hold up in court." Maggie absorbed this. "So you let him stay?" "I had no choice. The legal challenge would have taken years and he knew it. So he stayed as manager with his fraudulent stake and I—" Jack paused. "I stayed too, but not as the owner. As a hand." "Why?" she asked. "What were you watching for?" "For exactly this," he said. "I knew he'd push further. A man like Hale doesn't stop at partial, he wants the whole thing. I knew if I waited long enough, he would build the mechanism to take it completely, and when he did, he would have to leave a record. You can't move land without documentation. You can't transfer ownership without paper." He looked at her steadily. "I needed someone to find that paper." Maggie held his gaze for a long, clear moment. "You knew about the false panel." "I built that cabinet," he said quietly. "My father used it for the original deed documents. Hale doesn't know I know it exists." "So Hale put the green ledger there thinking it was his own hiding place," Maggie said. "And you needed someone to find it who wasn't you, because if you found it yourself, it's inadmissible," Jack said. "I'm a named party in a property dispute. Anything I find, anything I present gets challenged as self-serving. It needs to come from an independent source." He paused. "It needs to come from the bookkeeper." Maggie was quiet for a moment. Not because she was surprised she had written this conclusion in her own notebook 2 weeks ago, but because hearing it said aloud made it real in a different way. Made her role in it real. Made the weight of what she was carrying real. "How long were you waiting?" she asked. "Before I came." "4 bookkeepers," he said. "In 2 years. 3 left before they found anything. Carol Briggs found something, and Hale removed her before she could act on it. And then me," Maggie said. "And then you," he said. And there was something in his voice when he said it, not pity. Nothing even close to pity, something quieter and more considered than that. She thought about being 50 years old on a bus to Montana with 1 suitcase and no options. She thought about Richard Hale looking at her across the porch steps and calculating her value in a single sweep and finding it negligible. She thought about every room she had ever walked into that had already decided what it thought of her before she opened her mouth. "I have a question," she said. "Go ahead. The documentation I've built, is it enough on its own, without the green ledger which he's now moved?" Jack was quiet for a moment. "The account numbers you trace the diverted payment accounts. Those exist in the banking system. A financial auditor with subpoena authority can pull the full transaction history. And the land parcels. The shell companies have registered agents," he said. "Public record. If you have the company names from the transactions, a lawyer can trace the beneficial ownership. It takes time, but it's traceable." "The forged signature on your father's document," Maggie said. "That's separate from what I've found." "Yes, but what you've found establishes Hale's pattern of document fabrication. Forged invoices, forged payroll records, forged land transfers. A jury that sees all of it together." He stopped. "It corroborates everything." Maggie nodded slowly. She was thinking about the 31 pages in her suitcase. She was thinking about the shape of what she had built, not just the evidence, but the narrative of it, the way the numbers told a story that any person could follow if you laid it out in the right order. She had been a bookkeeper for 22 years. She knew how to make numbers legible to people who were not accountants. "I need 3 more days," she said. "There are 2 payroll routing patterns I haven't fully traced yet. When I have those, the documentation is airtight." 3 days, Jack repeated. He looked at her with an expression she was only now learning to name. It was the expression of a man who had been alone with something for too long and has just found unexpectedly that he is no longer alone with it. "Can you stay safe for 3 days? Hale thinks he's already won," she said. "He moved the cabinet. He thinks he removed the evidence. He doesn't know what I've copied. 3 days of me quietly finishing the legitimate summary is the last thing that will make him nervous." Jack looked at her for a long moment. "You're very good at this," he said. "I'm very good at being underestimated," she said. "Those aren't the same thing either." That almost smile again. Closer this time. She turned to leave. She had taken 3 steps when he said her name. Not Mrs. Collins. Maggie. She stopped and turned. "What he said to you when he looked at you that first day," Jack said. "Whatever he decided about you in that first 30 seconds, he was wrong." She looked at him standing in the near dark, this man who owned a ranch and had spent years pretending not to, who had built a plan around the possibility that someone would be stubborn enough and careful enough and brave enough to carry it through, and who was looking at her right now like she was exactly what he had been waiting for. "I know he was wrong," she said. "I've known that for a long time." She walked back toward the main building. Behind her, she heard the wire tool start up again at the fence, that steady metallic rhythm in the dark patient, and unhurried the sound of a man who has learned how to wait. She went to her office. She locked the door. She opened the payroll files for 2019 and 2020. The 2 years with the routing patterns she hadn't fully resolved yet, and she started reading with the focused, methodical attention of a woman who has 3 days to finish something that cannot be left unfinished. An hour into the 2019 records, she found it. Not a routing pattern, something worse. A name in the payroll file that she recognized not from the ranch records, but from her own research. One of the shell company registered agents she had traced from the land transaction documentation. A man named Gerald Foss, listed as a seasonal laborer on Silver Creek Ranch for 6 weeks in 2019, drawing wages from the ranch's operating payroll. Gerald Foss, who was also the registered agent for 2 of the shell companies that had received the fraudulent land transfers. He was not a ghost worker. He was real. He was part of the mechanism, a real person inside the shell company structure, drawing real wages from the ranch. He was helping to steal his name, spread across 2 separate layers of the fraud, in a way that connected the payroll manipulation directly to the land theft. Maggie's pen stopped moving. This was the link she had not been able to find. The connection between the financial fraud and the ownership theft, the thread that ran through both, and proved they were not separate schemes, but a single coordinated operation. She wrote Gerald Foss's name at the top of a clean page, and drew lines outward to every place he appeared in the documentation. When she finished, she had 7 connections across 4 separate fraud categories. It was the piece that made everything else provable. She stared at the page for a long time. Then she picked up her pen and wrote underneath it, in the careful, steady hand she had maintained across 31 pages of other people's crimes complete. Outside her locked door, Silver Creek Ranch went on about its night. Cattle in the east pasture, wind off the mountain, the distant sound of the creek, and Richard Hale, somewhere in the main house, sleeping with the confidence of a man who believed he had already removed the only evidence that could destroy him. He had 3 days left to believe that. She gave herself 1 more day with the payroll files before she told Jack the documentation was complete. Not because she doubted what she had found. Gerald Foss's name connecting the payroll fraud to the land theft was exactly the thread she had needed, and the 7 connection points she had mapped held up under every angle of examination she could apply. She gave herself the extra day because she understood with the particular clarity that comes from having done careful work for a long time that complete and sufficient were not the same thing. Complete meant every number was documented. Sufficient meant the documentation could survive a direct legal challenge from a man who had successfully protected himself for 7 years. She spent Tuesday working backward through the Gerald Foss connections, verifying each one against a second source, where a second source existed, noting where it didn't and why the primary source was still reliable. By Tuesday night, she had 38 pages in the second notebook, and she was satisfied. She found Jack at the fence line after dinner, same as always. "It's done," she said. He turned to look at her. She could see in his face that he understood she didn't mean the legitimate operating summary. "All of it?" he asked. "All of it," she said. "Including the connection I found Monday. One name, Gerald Foss, links the payroll manipulation directly to the shell company structure in the land transfers. Same person, different roles in the same scheme. It ties both fraud tracks together as a single coordinated operation." Jack was very still for a moment. Then he said, "Say that again." "Gerald Foss is in the payroll records as a seasonal laborer in 2019, she said carefully. He is also the registered agent on 2 of the shell companies that received the fraudulent land transfers. His name appears in both records. That means the payroll fraud and the ownership theft aren't separate, they were coordinated, and Foss is the connecting tissue." Jack turned away from her and faced the dark pasture and was quiet for a long time, long enough that she started to wonder what she was missing. "You know him," she said. It wasn't a question. He confirmed it anyway. "Gerald Foss worked for my father for 3 years, he said. Left the year before my father's stroke. I always thought it was coincidence, the timing of him leaving the timing of my father's health decline." He paused. "If Foss is inside the shell company structure, he was recruited before my father died. This was being planned while my father was still alive." The weight of that settled between them. "Hale recruited Foss before your father's death," Maggie said, working it through. "Established the mechanism before the estate transition. Which means the forged ownership document wasn't an opportunistic move after your father died. It was the final step in a plan that had been running for years before." "My father trusted Hale," Jack said. His voice was even, but she heard what was underneath it. "Trusted him completely. He would have had no reason to watch his own ranch manager." "That's how these systems work," Maggie said quietly. "They depend on trust. They depend on no one looking directly at the thing they're not supposed to see." Jack was quiet again. She waited. "How quickly can we move?" he said finally. "That depends on what moving looks like," she said. "I've been thinking about this. We can't take this to the county land board. Hale has relationships there, which is how he moved the fraudulent transfer documents through their office in the first place. We need to go above them." "State attorney's office," Jack said, "and a private attorney specializing in property fraud," Maggie said. "Simultaneously. The state attorney gives us investigative authority subpoenas for the banking records, access to the shell company registrations. The private attorney protects your ownership claim through the civil side while the criminal case builds." She paused. "And we need the sheriff, local jurisdiction. When the time comes to remove Hale from this property, we need the authority to do it." Jack looked at her. She had the sense she was doing it again. Whatever it was she did that produced that particular look on his face, the one she had started thinking of as the look of a man recalibrating something he thought he already had figured out. "You've been planning the response, not just the documentation," he said. "The documentation without the response is just paper," she said. "I've been building both." He nodded slowly. "I have an attorney in Billings, Marcus Webb. He's been working on the ownership dispute since 2015, doesn't know about the fraud documentation, because I didn't have it yet, but he knows the property history and the forged ownership claim." "Call him tonight," Maggie said. "Tell him you have documentation of systematic financial fraud and coordinated land theft. Tell him you need an emergency filing to freeze any pending property transfers while the evidence is reviewed." She paused. "Are there pending transfers?" "There's a transaction in the county recorder's office," Jack said. "Filed 3 weeks ago. I found out about it through a contact there. Transfer of the eastern water rights parcel, 40 acres, the most valuable single section of the ranch, to a company called Clear Range Holdings." Maggie's stomach tightened. When does it finalize? Standard processing is 30 days, Jack said. Filed 3 weeks ago. So we have approximately 1 week, she said. 1 week, he confirmed. She held that. 1 week. 7 days between where they were standing right now and Richard Hale legally owning the most valuable section of Silver Creek Ranch through a shell company he had been building toward for years. Call Webb tonight, she said. I'll make copies of everything in my documentation. I'll need access to a photocopier or a scanner not in this building. There's a machine at the church office in town, Jack said. Pastor there is someone I trust. He doesn't know anything about this situation, but he'll let me use the office without asking questions. Tomorrow morning, Maggie said, before Hale is up. Jack looked at her steadily. Are you ready for what comes after the copies are made? Because once we move, we can't slow it down. He'll know something is happening. I've been ready since the night I found the green ledger, she said. I told you I wasn't going to run. You did, he said. And then quiet and direct. Why you didn't know any of this when you got on that bus. You didn't know about the ranch or the fraud or any of it. You could have walked in here, done the legitimate summary, collected your pay, and walked out. Why dig? She thought about that. She could have given him several answers, all of them true. She could have talked about the 4 missing invoices on the first night, the professional instinct of a woman who has spent 22 years reading financial records. She could have talked about the look on Hale's face when she asked about the previous bookkeeper. Instead, she said, because somebody built a lie and expected nobody to bother looking at it closely enough. And I'm very tired of things being built on the assumption that nobody is going to look. He was quiet for a moment. Is that about this ranch? It's about everything, she said simply. But this ranch is where I'm standing right now. They were both quiet for a moment. The creek moved in the dark. Somewhere in the east pasture, a calf called once and then settled. 5:30 tomorrow morning, Jack said. Meet me at the south gate. She nodded and walked back toward the building. She had things to prepare. She spent the night organizing the documentation into 2 complete sequential copies. Original order, every page numbered, every cross-reference noted, so that when she got to the scanner in the morning, she could move through it fast. She packed her suitcase, not because she was planning to leave, but because she wanted everything that mattered consolidated in one place she could control. The second notebook went back inside the lining. Her original notebook, the shorthand one, her working notes she kept in her canvas bag. She was at the south gate at 5:25. Jack arrived at 5:28 with his truck keys and not much else. They drove to town without talking. She appreciated that. She was thinking, and she suspected he was too. The church office was cold and smelled like old paper, and the scanner was a heavy commercial unit that processed 30 pages a minute. She fed the documentation through twice one digital copy to a thumb drive. Jack had brought one to a second drive she kept, while Jack stood at the window with his coffee and a phone pressed to his ear. She heard fragments. Marcus, I know it's early. I've got the documentation we needed. Full financial fraud record, 7 years, plus the land transfer mechanism. I need a freeze on the Clear Range Holdings transaction before it finalizes. A pause. I understand. Yes, all of it. Another pause longer. She found the Foss connection. Whatever Webb said in response to that made Jack turn slightly away from the window, and she could not see his face. She finished the second scan, pocketed her thumb drive, assembled her original pages back into sequence, and returned them to the notebook. Jack finished his call and turned around. His face was controlled, but she was learning to read past the control. Webb is filing the emergency injunction this morning, he said, to freeze the Clear Range transfer. He's also contacting the state attorney's office. He has a relationship there from a previous case. How long for the injunction? Hours if the judge is available. By end of business today if not. He paused. He also said when I described the documentation, he said it's the strongest property fraud case he's seen in 20 years of practice. Maggie absorbed that without much visible reaction, which was how she absorbed most things. but she felt it. "What happens when Hale finds out about the injunction?" she asked. "He finds out when the county recorder notifies him that the clear-range transfer has been frozen pending legal review," Jack said. "That notification goes to him directly. At that point, he knows the game is over, but he won't know yet how much we have or where it came from." "He'll come to me," Maggie said. Jack looked at her. "Yes, he will." "Good," she said. "I want him to." They drove back to Silver Creek in the early morning light, and Maggie looked out the window at the Montana landscape and thought about Richard Hale, waking up this morning in the main house of a ranch he believed was already mostly his, going about his Tuesday with the confidence of a man who has successfully run his scheme for 7 years and successfully removed the evidence 3 days ago. She thought about the phone call he was going to receive. She thought about the look on his face when he came to find her. She was ready for it. The call reached Hale at 2:17 in the afternoon. She knew because she heard him on the phone through the wall of the office, his voice carrying with that particular edge that controlled men allow through only when they are genuinely surprised, and Richard Hale was genuinely surprised. She heard him say, "What do you mean frozen?" And then silence, and then, "On what basis?" And then more silence longer, and when he spoke again, his voice was lower, which was the most alarming sound she had heard from him yet. She did not stop working. She kept her eyes on the operating summary spreadsheet, and she typed and she waited. He was at her door in 4 minutes. She looked up with a politely attentive expression. "Maggie," he said. His voice was the warmest she had ever heard it, which told her everything. "I need to ask you something directly." "Of course," she said. He came in. He did not sit. He stood in front of her desk with his hands in his pockets, a position she recognized as someone trying to appear casual while managing something they cannot afford to show, and he looked at her with those assessing eyes. "Have you spoken to anyone outside this ranch about the financial records?" he asked. She held his gaze. "My job is confidential work for this ranch," she said. "I take that seriously." "That's not what I asked," he said. "I know," she said evenly. The warmth dropped off his face. Just like that. She watched it go and saw what was underneath it, not rage, which would have been manageable, but calculation. Cold, rapid, professional calculation. "There is a legal action being filed," he said, "against a property transfer I have authorized on behalf of this ranch. Someone has provided information to an attorney that they could only have accessed from these financial records." "That sounds serious," Maggie said. "You might want to call your own attorney." He stared at her. "Did you do this?" She looked at him for a long, steady moment. And then she said clearly, and without any particular emphasis, "Mr. Hale, I am a bookkeeper. I read numbers and I document what they say. That's what I was hired to do." He leaned forward and put both hands on the edge of her desk. "You have no idea what you have put in motion," he said very quietly. "You have no idea who you are dealing with." "I have a fairly good idea," she said, "of exactly who I'm dealing with." The door opened behind him. Jack Holloway walked in. He was not wearing his fence hand clothes. He was wearing a collared shirt and his good boots, and he had an air about him. Not aggressive, not theatrical. Simply the air of a man who has walked into a room he owns and is fully aware of that fact. Richard Hale turned, and she watched the exact moment when Richard Hale looked at Jack Holloway and understood that the thing he thought he had been managing for 8 years had not been managed at all. "Jack," Hale said. His voice was careful now, stripped of everything. "Richard," Jack said. He looked at Maggie first. "You all right?" "Fine," she said. He nodded. Then he looked at Hale with those quiet eyes that she now understood had been watching this man, this ranch, this specific moment for 8 years. "My attorney filed an emergency injunction this morning," Jack said. "The clear-range transfer is frozen. The state attorney's office has been contacted and will be opening a formal inquiry into Silver Creek Ranch's financial records going back to 2015. He paused. "You're going to want to call your lawyer, Richard." Hale looked between the two of them. She watched him run the calculation, the same rapid assessment she had seen on his face a dozen times. Except this time the numbers were not coming out in his favor, and he knew it. You can't prove anything, he said. Whatever she found, whatever she thinks she found. 38 pages, Maggie said. Dated cross-referenced with account numbers and shell company registrations and payroll routing records and survey coordinates. Gerald Foss's name appears in 7 separate locations across 4 fraud categories. She held his gaze. I'm thorough. The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever heard. Richard Hale straightened. He adjusted his collar. He looked at Jack, then at her, then at Jack again. She could see him making a calculation that was different from all the ones that had come before it, not about how to manage the situation, but about how much the situation had already exceeded his ability to manage it. I'd like to make a call, he said. From outside this office, Jack said. Hale walked to the door. He stopped without turning around. I built this operation for years, he said to no one in particular, or to both of them, or to the room itself. This ranch was going to waste. Thomas Holloway's boy didn't even want to run it. I made it profitable. You stole it, Jack said quietly. There's a difference. Hale walked out. Jack looked at Maggie. You okay? I'm better than okay, she said. She was surprised to find that was true. She had expected to feel shaken, or hollowed out, or some complicated version of frightened. Instead, she felt the particular cleanness that comes when a thing you have been carrying is finally set down in the right place. The sheriff is on his way, Jack said. Webb called him directly. He'll be here within the hour. Maggie nodded. She looked at the operating summary spreadsheet still open on her screen. She looked at the canvas bag on the floor with the notebook inside. She looked at Jack Holloway, standing in the middle of the office that had belonged to his father's ranch manager for 8 years, occupying the space with the steady, undemonstrative certainty of a man who has come home. The meeting, she said. The full meeting, the workers, the auditors, the county officials. When does that happen? Webb says within the week, Jack said. The injunction buys us time to assemble everyone properly. He wants you there. I'll be there, she said. Jack looked at her for a moment. You know what you did. I read some ledgers, she said. Maggie. She met his eyes. You know what you did, he said again. She did know. She had known since Monday night when she wrote the word complete at the bottom of the Gerald Foss page and looked at 38 pages of truth she had built out of nothing but numbers and stubbornness, and the conviction that things built on lies deserved to be examined carefully. Outside the office window, she heard gravel under tires and looked out to see 2 vehicles she didn't recognize pulling up the ranch road. The sheriff was early. Richard Hale was standing in the yard when the first vehicle stopped. She watched him through the window. He was very still, very straight, with the particular posture of a man who has spent his life using authority as armor and is only now discovering what it feels like when the armor comes off. Maggie Collins sat at her desk in the small office that smelled like old paper and lamp oil, and she watched the man who had threatened her walk toward the people who had come to hold him accountable, and she felt something settle in her chest that she did not immediately have a word for. It was something close to justice. But it was also something more personal than that. Something that had to do with walking into rooms that have already decided what they think of you and being the person who changes what happens next anyway. She had been doing that her whole life. She just had not always had the numbers to prove it. The sheriff's name was Dale Pruitt, and he was the kind of man who had spent 30 years in Montana law enforcement, developing the particular patience of someone who has learned that the truth almost always arrives, eventually, just rarely on anyone's preferred schedule. He came into the office with his deputy behind him, and he looked at Maggie with the careful, non-committal expression of a law enforcement officer who has been told he is walking into a property fraud situation and is reserving judgment until he understands whose side the evidence is actually on. Mrs. Collins, he said, I'm told you have documentation. I do, she said. I'm going to need to see it. She reached into her canvas bag and pulled out the original notebook, the clean, sequential, 38-page version, and set it on the desk in front of him. She also set down the thumb drive. The notebook is self-contained, she said. Every entry is dated and cross-referenced. The thumb drive has scanned copies of the original source documents from the ranch files organized in the same sequence. The account numbers in Section 3 can be verified against banking records with subpoena authority. The shell company registrations in Section 5 are public record. You can pull them from the state business registry with the names I provided. Pruitt picked up the notebook. He opened it to the first page. He read for a moment. Then he looked up at her. "How long did this take you?" he asked. 3 weeks, she said. "Give or take." He looked back at the notebook, turned a few pages, stopped at the Gerald Foss section, read for longer. His expression did not change dramatically, but she had spent 3 weeks reading subtle signals, and she could see the slight shift in his attention when he understood what he was looking at. "Deputy," he said, "go find Mr. Hale and make sure he stays on the property." The deputy left. Pruitt sat down across from Maggie and kept reading. Jack stood in the corner of the room with his arms crossed and said nothing, which was she was learning one of the things he did best. It took Pruitt 25 minutes to read through the complete documentation. He did not rush. He went back twice, once to the payroll section, once to the land transfer coordinates, and cross-referenced them with pages he had already read. When he finished, he closed the notebook and set it carefully on the desk and looked at Maggie with an expression that was no longer carefully non-committal. "This is thorough work," he said. "Thank you," she said. "I'm going to need to take this documentation into evidence." He paused. "You have copies?" "2, she said. "One with Mr. Holloway's attorney in Billings. One in my personal possession." He nodded. "I'm going to need a formal statement from you this afternoon, and I need to tell you what you've documented here is going to require a full forensic accounting review before we can file charges. That process takes time." "I understand," she said. "The injunction on the clear-range transfer buys that time." He looked at her steadily. "Yes, it does." He stood. "Mrs. Collins, in 30 years of law enforcement, I have had people hand me evidence in a lot of different states of completeness." He picked up the notebook. "This is the most complete, unsolicited documentation I have ever received from a civilian." He walked out to find Richard Hale. Maggie sat for a moment in the empty office. Then she looked at Jack. "Unsolicited," she said. "High praise from Pruitt," Jack said. "Trust me." She almost laughed. She was surprised to find that laughed lived somewhere close to the surface right now, which was not what she would have predicted for the afternoon of the day she handed 38 pages of evidence to a county sheriff. The formal statement took 2 hours. Pruitt's deputy recorded it at the kitchen table of the main house, while Hale sat in the living room with his attorney on speakerphone, and Pruitt stood in the yard making his own calls. She walked through the documentation systematically, how she found the first discrepancy, how the pattern emerged, how she identified the false panel, what the green ledger contained, how the Gerald Foss connection completed the picture. The deputy typed and occasionally asked her to repeat something, and she repeated it clearly and without elaboration. When it was done, she signed the statement and walked outside. The ranch had a different quality to it now. She could not have explained it precisely. Nothing visible had changed. The buildings were the same, the pastures were the same, the mountain line on the horizon was the same, but something in the air had shifted. Like a sound that has been present so long you stopped hearing, it has finally stopped, and the silence it leaves behind feels both strange and correct. She found Jack at the south pasture fence. He was not working on it. He was just standing there looking out at the land with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Open in a way that his face was usually not the careful control he maintained. Loosened by something she thought might simply be exhaustion. The exhaustion of a man who has been holding a very specific kind of vigilance for 8 years and has just been told he can stop. "How are you doing?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. Honest answer, always. "I don't entirely know yet," he said. 8 years is a long time to want one thing. When you finally get it, there's a period where you don't know what to do with your hands. She understood that. She understood it in a way that had nothing to do with ranches or fraud or legal injunctions. She understood it from the particular experience of a woman who has survived something that was supposed to define her and is standing on the other side of it, trying to figure out who she is when she is not surviving anymore. The workers, she said, the stolen wages, the web is already on it, Jack said. The payroll documentation you built makes it straightforward. We know exactly which pay periods were manipulated and by how much. Every man on this ranch is going to be made whole. She nodded. She thought about the 8 men who ate dinner at that table every evening and treated her with that baffled courtesy, and had no idea that their wages had been systematically skimmed for years. She thought about what it was going to mean to them to receive that money, not just the amount, but the acknowledgement that someone had seen it, documented it, and refused to let it stand. "When does the full meeting happen?" she asked. "Friday," Jack said. "Webb is bringing 2 associates. The state attorney's office is sending an investigator. Pruitt will be there, and I'm asking all the ranch workers to be present." He paused. "I want them to hear it directly, not secondhand. They deserve to understand what happened on this property." She thought about standing in a room full of people with 38 pages of documentation and explaining clearly and completely exactly what had been done and how she had found it. She felt the familiar pre-performance steadiness settle into her, the same steadiness that had carried her through 22 years of presenting financial reports to people who thought they already knew what the numbers said. "I'll be ready," she said. Friday came with a cold front off the mountains and a sky the color of brushed steel. By 9 in the morning, the main house living room held 14 people. 6 ranch workers, Marcus Webb and his 2 associates. The state attorney's investigator, Sheriff Pruitt, and his deputy, the county land board director, who had been summoned with the particular authority of a legal injunction, and Jack Holloway, who sat at the far end of the room and said nothing as people filed in. Maggie stood at the front with her notebook and the original documentation organized on the table beside her. She looked at the room. She recognized the particular quality of the attention in it. Some people curious, some people skeptical, 1 or 2 already hostile, all of them waiting to assess the credibility of the woman standing at the front before she said a single word. She had stood in rooms like this before. She had spent her entire career standing in rooms like this. She opened the notebook. "I'm going to walk you through 7 years of financial records," she said. "I'm going to be specific. I'm going to be sequential. And I'm going to cite the source document for every claim I make. If you have questions, hold them until I've completed each section, because most questions will be answered before I finish." She paused. "This will take approximately 90 minutes. She began. She started with the supplier invoices. Triple Fork Western Range Materials, High Plains Equipment, and she walked through each diversion pattern with the account numbers displayed and the source documents referenced. She moved to the ghost payroll entries and explained the routing mechanism. She explained the land transaction structure, the false parcels, the shell companies, the transfer documentation, and she showed how the Clear Range Holdings filing represented the culmination of a process that had been running since 2016. And then she got to Gerald Foss. She watched the room when she laid out the Foss connections. Watched the county land board director's face go through several rapid transitions. Watched the state attorney's investigator lean forward with the focused attention of someone who has just seen the piece that completes the picture. Watched the ranch workers, the 6 men sitting together on one side of the room, exchange looks that moved through confusion into something harder and more personal. Tom Briggs. The eldest of the ranch hands, a man of about 60, who had worked Silver Creek for 11 years, and rarely said more than necessary, raised his hand when she got to the payroll section. "You're saying we were short paid," he said. "How much?" "Your payroll entry specifically," Maggie said, "shows a diversion of approximately $1,400 across the 2020 and 2021 fiscal years. Each man's exact amount varies based on pay period and the timing of the manipulation." She looked at him directly. "Every shortfall is documented. Every one of you will be paid back in full." Tom Briggs looked at Jack. Jack nodded once. Tom looked back at Maggie and said, "Go on then." She went on. When Richard Hale's attorney attempted an interruption during the land transfer section, standing up and declaring that the documentation had been obtained through unauthorized access to client-privileged financial records. Sheriff Pruitt said, "Sit down, counselor," in the tone of a man who has been patient for a long time and has reached the natural end of it. The attorney sat down. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Marcus Webb spoke, laying out the legal framework, the injunction status, the criminal referral timeline. The state attorney's investigator asked 3 questions, all of them specific and technical, all of which she answered without referring back to the notebook because she had memorized it. The county land board director asked 2 questions, both of which revealed that he was trying to assess his own office's exposure in the fraudulent transfer process, and Webb handled those with the particular precision of a lawyer who has anticipated exactly that concern. Richard Hale sat in a chair near the window with his attorney beside him, and he did not speak. She looked at him once during the presentation, just once during the FOSS section, and she saw on his face something she had not expected to see there. Not rage, not denial, something quieter than that. The particular expression of a man who has spent years building something that required the assumption that no one would look too carefully and is confronting the fact that someone looked very carefully indeed. He looked for just a moment like a man who understood exactly what had happened to him. Then he looked away, and she looked away, and she kept going. Pruitt formally notified Hale of his status at the conclusion of the meeting. She did not watch that part. She stood at the window, the same window through which she had watched the sheriff's vehicles arrive 4 days ago, and she listened to the procedural language, the rights notification, the arrangements for a voluntary appearance at the county office the following morning, and she looked out at the ranch, the east pasture, the barn, the creek line in the distance with the cottonwoods along it going yellow with the season. 40 acres of water rights that had been a week from legal transfer to a shell company and were now frozen, protected, returned to the man whose grandfather had surveyed the boundary lines 130 years ago. She heard footsteps behind her and did not turn around because she recognized them. "It's done," Jack said. "It's the beginning of done," she said. "The forensic audit, the criminal proceeding, the civil ownership restoration, that's months of process." "I know," he said, "but the thing that was happening is stopped. The thing that needed to be found was found." He paused. "That part is done. Because of you." She turned then. He was closer than she expected, which meant she was looking up at him in a way that was slightly unfamiliar, and he was looking down at her with that expression she had catalogued over the course of 3 weeks. The one that was not assessment, and not pity, and not the calibrated warmth of a man performing consideration, but something quieter and more real than any of those things. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Go ahead." "What do you want to do next?" he said. "Not what you have to do, not what the legal process requires. What do you want?" She had been thinking about this since Monday night, since the moment she wrote complete in the notebook, and understood that the work she had come here to do, the work she had not known she was coming here to do, when she boarded that bus was finished. She had been carrying the question the way she had carried everything else carefully without showing it. "I don't know yet," she said. "That's the honest answer." He nodded. "Fair enough." He paused. "The ranch is going to need a full accounting overhaul. 7 years of fraud, unwound legitimate records rebuilt from the ground up, new systems established. It's months of work." He held her gaze. "I'd like you to do it. Not as a favor. As a contracted position properly compensated your terms." She looked at him. "You trust me with that." "Maggie," he said, and the way he said her name had the same quality it had carried that night at the fence line when he'd said it for the first time, direct and uncalculated and entirely without pretense. "You took 38 pages of truth out of 7 years of deliberate concealment, using nothing but patience and a notebook, and the conviction that lies deserve to be examined. There is no person on this earth I trust more to rebuild what was broken." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, Tom Briggs and 2 of the other ranch workers were walking toward the barn, and she could see from the set of their shoulders and the way they moved together that they were talking. Really. Talking the way men talk when something has shifted in their world, and they are trying to understand the new shape of it. She thought about the bus that had dropped her at the edge of Silver Creek Road with her one suitcase and her canvas bag, and a folded piece of paper with an address on it, and absolutely nothing else. She thought about what it had felt like to walk through that gate for the first time, and have a man look at her from a fence line, with quiet assessing eyes that did not subtract anything from her. She thought about 38 pages. She thought about Gerald Foss's name in 7 places. She thought about the word complete, written in her own handwriting at the bottom of the last page. She thought about a woman who had spent her whole life being assessed in doorways and found insufficient, and who had just stood at the front of a room for 90 minutes and made 14 people understand the precise architecture of a 7-year lie. "Your terms," Jack said again. "Whatever you need." She looked at him. She looked out at the ranch. She looked at Tom Briggs disappearing into the barn with his colleagues in the yellow October light. "I'll need a proper office," she said. "Not that closet off the supply room, a real workspace with adequate light and a filing system I build from scratch." "Done," he said. "I'll need direct access to the banking records without going through an intermediary." "Done. And I'll need you to stop pretending to be a fence hand," she said. "It's a convincing performance, but it's going to be logistically complicated going forward." He did almost smile, all the way this time. And it changed his face in a way that made her understand why he kept it so controlled. Because when Jack Holloway actually smiled, it was not a small thing. "I think I can manage that," he said. Maggie Collins picked up her canvas bag from the chair where she had set it after the meeting. She settled the strap on her shoulder. She looked one more time at the window at the ranch that was returning to itself acre by acre, and dollar by dollar, and truth by truth. She had come to Silver Creek with nothing but a suitcase and a dead man's debts and the bone-deep stubbornness of a woman who had been underestimated so many times. She had stopped being surprised by it and started being strategic about it. She was leaving with something she had not had in years, not safety exactly, and not certainty, because she had learned long ago that neither of those things were ever actually guaranteed. Something better than both of those things. She was leaving with the knowledge of exactly what she was capable of when someone finally gave her the right problem and enough room to solve it. And that knowledge, unlike a job or a paycheck or anyone's approval, was hers completely earned in the quiet hours of a small office, with a steady lamp built, page by page, from numbers that told the truth when she asked them to. Nobody had given it to her. Nobody could take it away. Maggie Collins had found it herself, the same way she had found everything that mattered in her life, by refusing to look away from what was right in front of her, and by trusting that the truth, when you finally laid it out in full, was always stronger than the lie built to hide it.